Hello.
Well, hello. How are you doing?
Hello, I'm good. Thanks. Can you hear me well?
Absolutely. Can you hear me pretty good?
Yeah, all good. So thanks for joining us. For the viewers, can you just state your name because I didn't want to pronounce it wrong.
Oh, absolutely. So my name is Soslan Temanson, Soslantemanson.
Right, okay. But I can call you Soz, can't I? Because I've
Uh,
seen that on a.
Oh, absolutely. Just call me Sauce. That's what normally people call me. So you're welcome to just call me anytime. Or,
Okay. Soz, today we're going to be discussing your life events, because I know you've gone through quite. So I wanted to really talk about you because you're very fascinating life, if I'm honest. So I'm going to start from the very beginning. So you was born in Russia.
I was born in Russia on October 7th, 1998. And so it was it was a cool experience how I was born. And I was born in a war-torn city called Vladikavkaz, Russia, and so it was a very rough upbringing.
And you were surrendered to an orphanage. Okay.
Right at birth. Yep.
Wow. So I know you was adopted by a family from Oregon.
Uh, so the funny part is, so the family that came to Russia, they were so the family that came to Russia for the first time, they were actually English, and so they were from Wales, England, and
Oh, I'm from
so
Wales.
was it?
I'm from Wales.
Oh, get out! So their last name was Newell, Newell.
I haven't heard that over here, but yeah, I'm from Wales.
Oh, that's cool. So he was on. So the father was on Princess Diana's royal guard, and so since he was in Princess Diana's royal guard, they were non-Americans hypothetically. They were just on dual citizenship, and
Oh, right.
so because of that, they left their American documentation all back at home, and so from there they were able to um, go to Russia because Americans were not allowed to go to this certain part of Russia because it was prohibited and it was not a touristy attraction. So that's why they were not allowed to travel in that area. And so when they went to Russia for the first time, to adopt us, they're like, hey, the Russian military went on the plane. They're like, hey, how many people are like, who's all American? And if you're an American at that part of Russia, you were arrested and you were sent back. So they looked through all their documentation. And so luckily they had all their documentation back at home in England. And so it was a very interesting experience for them indeed. And so when they went to the orphanage to adopt one girl, so that's the whole thing. They only wanted one girl, but the orphanage is like take as many kids as you want or as many kids as you can. So they ended up taking back four boys and three girls, and I was one of the boys. And what seems to be a little bit more interesting about this whole adoption thing was that I wasn't even supposed to be adopted. I was supposed to be in Russia, in Moscow, making weapons for Vladimir Putin's army, and that's what they did with kids that were around after 5 years old. Um, they would bring them um, to Moscow to make like weapons because they have tiny hands and stuff, and it starts that brainwashing of joining the military, and then you're entrapped into the military system until you retire. And so that's the whole thing. It's a very not a good way of getting people in the military.
No. Um, so I know I read as well. I think it was on Blue State Conversations, and I listened to that. And 2 hours later, was it after leaving the orphanage? It was bombed by Georgia.
Yes, it was. Our orphanage was bombed. A matter of fact, and so if we would have stayed in, or if we would have stayed at, if we would have stayed in Russia or not in Russia, if we would have stayed at the orphanage, I would not be here speaking to you right now. Because the orphanage did get bombed, over 150 babies were killed, and it was flattened out. And so that's the sad part about the orphanage. And so it was more of an escape. At that point, it ended up being more of an escape mission to get us out as soon as possible. So we went to Georgia, the country, which was actually about 15 minutes away from our orphanage. And so now, for the context for your listeners, So this was back in 2000 when Russia was trying to push into Georgia. So what happened is that it's kind of the same thing happening right now with Ukraine and Russia, where Russia at that time was trying to take over Georgia. So they did a heavy military attack on Georgia, and so then Georgia would retaliate by attacking them. So it ended up going back and forth. But our city was the brunt of it, just like Belgrade is the brunt of the war in Russia regarding the Ukraine war right now.
I mean, for me, 2 hours later, I mean, I can't believe someone was looking out for you.
Absolutely, and I believe it was I believe it was God. As a man of faith and as a podcaster myself and as influencer, a lot of things that I tend to overlook at it. It's interesting how it takes major life instances in my life, major traumatic events, to make me really look at, man, you should have died so many. There were so many opportunities when you could have died, but God is watching over you, and He's got a bigger plan that you don't know, but He's making sure that you can be a testimony to others and give them encouragement and optimism, even during the times of trouble. So that's the cool thing that I have to, when looking back on it, because it was interesting because when I came to America, I had chicken pox while we were traveling to America, and so that was a very interesting adventure within itself. And I know, luckily, we got into the states at that time. Now, if I would have been adopted like in this time and age with COVID and with everything else, I'd probably been sent back because I would have been probably the bubonic plague and been like unclean. So then it probably sent me back. I'm being sarcastic. I'm trying to add comedy in there, but I don't think it's going very well, is it?
Get in there.
No. Oh, sorry.
Okay. So you fled to America, 2006. Um,
So,
oh, go on.
so after 2006, I spent about 2.5 years in Bend, Oregon. And from Bend, Oregon, we traveled around the world. We went to family in England. We went to Hawaii. And we also went to Canada. So during that time, it was because our family raced horses and they also did dirt bike. And so the what kind of horse racing we did was, for instance, it was English style horse racing. For It's called dressage, which is showing how good your horse is, like through certain circumstances, through certain um, like not role playing, but like through certain like callings and like as how well your horse is pretty much put together and how well your horse can listen to you. And so that's what kind of horse racing we did. So after we went to Canada, um, and once we kind of got back into the routine of things, I was adopted again by another family in Wisconsin. And that was about 2.5 years later. And that's when I was 10 years old. And we moved to Wisconsin then.
And is that when did you join the Air Force?
So after the Air Force, um, so during my high school time, I founded a suicide prevention. Well, no, I founded an anti-bullying group in high school. I sat on cross country for 4 years. All I actually sat on cross country all since I joined middle school and high school. Sat on varsity all those years. I also sat on varsity in track and field. And then it wasn't. So the funny part is, let me tell you about the Air Force thing. So actually, I was in the Army Reserves, to be frank. And so from being in the Army Reserves, I did that in more of in defiance of my parents' will and tuition, because when you turn 18, I thought I knew everything when I turned 18, and I thought if I was an adult, I could do anything I wanted. Well, that's totally false. So I went to the Army recruiter's office. I said, "Hey, it's my birthday, and we're going to go for a birthday celebration." So I told my parents, I'm like, "Hey, can I just go to I want to take a small road trip." And so that road trip ended up being to the Army Reserves Recruiting Center. And so I joined the Army Reserves on October 7th, 2016, actually. And so, and then in 2017, I decided to part ways from the Army Reserves and then joined the Air Force. And that was more of a joint, with my parents. That was more of a joint conversation because talked to them. I'm like, how do I how do I make a good opportunity and a good futuristic? What can I do for the best course of action for my life? Because I knew I wanted to be an officer in the military, and I knew that the Army Reserves was not the place, and that the Army Reserves you couldn't travel. But I wanted to travel after I graduated high school. So I graduated in high school in 20. Let's see, not too long after I got out of the Army Reserves. Um, so after I got out of the Army Reserves, I went and to the Air Force, and I went to the basic training uh, on October 8th, 2018. And
So they,
so,
oh,
what's that?
no, continue. Go on. Sorry.
It- So after I joined the Air Force, we went through basic training. I would do basic training all over again. It was the best part of my life, and it was the most best part of my life because it was the most structured. And there were some challenges in basic training. Now, there were ups and downs, and there were times when I just wanted to go home. Like, for instance, um, when I flew to uh, when I flew from Milwaukee to San Antonio, that was one of my worst flights I've ever taken. Now, it's not because of it was a rocky flight. That's besides the fact because I fly a lot for work and stuff. But it made it worse because I knew that I was nervous because I didn't know what was going to happen, and so I got into my Bible heavily. And that's the most. That is truly the most time I read my Bible, and I was like so excited. And so because of it, since I was reading my Bible and stuff, I found peace and comfort through it. So then basic training didn't really wasn't that bad because I was already prepared through spiritually. I was already prepared. And see, and that's the whole thing I tell people when joining the military. If you do not have some sort of a person that gives you hope, for instance, like either through God or through a goal that you have, you're gonna have a rough time in basic training because you're gonna lose that drive and energy to really thrive. And you're going to lose that and you're going to fade out. And we saw those kind of people in the military where they're like, oh, okay, I'm going to be all as brunt as I can. But when you stay up for somebody 2 hours, that makes or breaks a person. And so for me, it didn't make a matter because it didn't make a matter of fact, for me, it didn't impact me at all because I just only would go into prayer. And it seemed like every time I went into prayer, I was revived and I could stay up longer. And so, of course, that ended, and we went to bed, and I slept like a baby once we got some time to sleep. And so, but we saw where my my bunkmate next to me, we saw where he didn't really have a goal in mind. And the only way you could tell if people didn't have a goal in mind in the military is the way that they dressed, the way that they composed themselves. If they were careless, number one. Number two, if they didn't really take time to like look at their uniform, to like take time to like cut the strings, or because I would spend hours on Sunday cutting the strings and making my bed pristine because when we had inspections on Monday morning, that following morning, they would actually grab a quarter, bounce the quarter on the bed, and if it bounced, it was you passed, and if it didn't bounce, you failed, and that means if that individual fails, the whole flight fails. So it's like one team, one fight. So what happened is my bunkmate next to me, he just didn't really care. He had no drive, and you can tell that. And so I'm like, hey, can I help you make your bed, or can I help you get your uniform all dressed? And he's like, oh, absolutely. So then he just kind of was very careless. And then the sad part is he did leave. He was kind of asked to leave the military because he wasn't learning anything. And if you don't learn anything, you don't want to just you just if you're not learning anything, then that's not going to be really, you don't have that drive in the military, and they don't need that. They need people that have a drive. They need a person that has ambition and has goals. So that's what brought me over to Japan. And so I was stationed at Japan after I got out of tech school. But the interesting part is that when you're in the military, you get choices. They give you about 8 places where you want to go. It's called your dream sheet. And so on my dream sheet, I put mine at North Dakota. I put all like New Mexico. I put like Colorado, and I also put like bases that people don't like because I'm a huge outdoors guy. And and I asterized or I pinpointed and I said made a big deal about mine at North Dakota. Now for people that now in the Air Force, if you go to mine at North Dakota, that's like a base that you thought you got in trouble. You're like, okay, why did I get in trouble and all that? Like it's in the middle of nowhere. But if you're country folk and if you love the country and if you love outdoors, mine at North Dakota is like your jackpot, like winning Vegas. So I love the outdoors. And you are in proximity of Colorado, you're in proximity of like the mountains and stuff. So that's why I love it. So the sad part is I didn't get mine in North Dakota. I got Tokyo, Japan instead. And so the following, let's see, the following months I went to Tokyo. And after Tokyo, it was interesting going there. People were, it was a very hustling and bustling city. They had police officers that would literally cram people on the subway systems. And they made sure that the doors were shut. And you were packed like sardines in the subway systems. And it was very interesting. And one thing that I found out while being at station at Tokyo, Japan, is that they rely heavily on bicycles and very heavily on the subway system. And so, with that subway system, it took about 30 minutes, and you went through about a couple of stations because they would stop at one station and about 50 or 60 feet, they would stop at another. And that's one good optimistic I have to give regarding the transit system in Japan. And a lot of them walked and everything, the buildings were very close, compact together. So there were really no alleyways. And if there were alleyways, you stayed far away from those alleyways because that means you were, if you wanted to get in trouble, you just go find an alleyway and then you got it. So once I was in Japan and Tokyo, I got myself involved in church, off base and on base. I was involved in three different churches. And so um, because of that, I surrounded myself with good friends, lifelong friends. And so, it was interesting that October hit of 2019 when that changed my life forever. Sorry if I talk too much. I should probably ask you.
That's
Sorry
no
about that. I
problem.
didn't mean to do that.
No, that's fine. I was just thinking, I couldn't stick that in certainly in Japan on the tube because I go to London on the tube and there's only about 5 people on there and I can't stick that. Just too many people for me. So that, I mean, how was that on the tube with all those people and
I would have loved. I would have loved. Actually, my number one overseas station was. It was actually England. It was Englewood Air Force Base in England. But the sad part is that they didn't bring me to England either. The only reason why I wanted, the only reason why I wanted England was because my family was there, and it seems like they took all the opposites. And it was interesting because it was interesting, but I'm pretty sure that they kind of put me in that one, gave me that extra base just because of my prior service, which didn't make sense. But I thought it was everybody, like I thought it was everybody else, and it was very interesting. And the flight though was very uncomfortable. I flew to England and I have like fly a long time, like I fly long distances. And my kind of style, if I have to fly more than 3.5 hours, I normally purchase a first class ticket. I take that extra buck and I either purchase a first class ticket because I mean, when you're stationed in Japan, that 16 and a half hour flight is was a treacherous flight because it was economy, basic economy, and you were like crammed like sardines. And to make it worse, it was a daytime flight. So you landed, so you took off in the morning, and then you flew the whole entire daytime into the following day at night at during the day. And I'm like, oh my goodness. And so then jet lag, you want to talk about jet lag? That jet lag lasted for about a week. And I thought England's jet lag was bad, but no.
I think 2 days now from when this podcast is, I'm going to New York, and I've never done a big fly like from Wales now where I am. That's I think 9 hours, but the longest flight I think I've done is three. So I don't know how I'm going to cope with 8 hours. What tips have you got for someone in the Air Force? What tips could you give me for a long flight?
So it depends what you're flying. And if you, so I just want to tell you, I love flying. And so I travel a lot. And so we should do another episode regarding traveling tips. Because I am a huge travel geek. I have top five airlines that are good to fly. And I heard that Ryanair, is it true that Ryanair is spiking up their costs?
I don't know. I've flown with Ryanair a few times, but that was
What do
a
you
few.
think of that?
I don't know. I didn't know about that.
Oh, what's your go-to airline?
We are EasyJet, I believe.
Now, what's that kind of a jet? Like, what's EasyJet? Like, is it is it like what Delta or United has? Like, they have first class, second, or economy or premium, or what's their layout like?
I don't know. I'm not aware. Because I didn't book the flight myself, so I don't.
Oh,
I'm
oh, you didn't.
Is first
Um,
class.
was it?
Yeah. We didn't take that though. We've gone for middle class, I think.
Because for so for anyone that's flying in economy class and stuff, my tip would I should have taken my own tip at that time. It would definitely have to be make sure that you bring your own blanket. Number one, okay. Number two, bring your own pillow because you know if you take the window seat, you're kind of entrapped by the window and like you can't lean on anyone. And do not and whatever you do now on those international flights, do not sit in the middle of the row. Like there's three seats. Don't sit. I would say stay far away from, or talk to your seatmate and say, "Hey, can I take the window or can I take the window seat or even the aisle seat?" Because I sat in the aisle row, or not the aisle row. I sat in the middle of the row, or like in the middle of this middle seat out of the three. And those are very interesting flights because you're like, okay, well, I don't want to lean too far left or too far right because I might be sleeping on their shoulders. And especially in this day and age, you have to keep, in this day and age, along with the whole mask wearing, if you lean too close to an individual, they get all, well, you're too close. You're encroaching on my 6 feet of space, And so then, you know, it's kind of funny, isn't it?
Oh, I know.
So, okay, so I feel like that this could be a part two podcast because there's so much to talk about with the whole Air Force.
We should
But
move on, I think.
you think so? Oh, okay. So with the Air Force stuff,
Well, we'll stick
uh,
with the course. We'll move on from the travel tips. We'll leave.
oh, okay. So from the Air Force, so October 2nd, I was at a Bible study. I was at a Bible study and I stood up and then I collapsed. And it was the oddest thing because what happened is I thought while I was sitting on the couch or while I was sitting in the chair, I started grabbing my chest like as if I was having a heart attack because I was having a hard time breathing and then I was like starting to get impaired speech. Now, I don't drink. And so for me to get impaired speech, I knew that was a problem because I already suffered a mini stroke the prior week. And when I was at the doctor's office, he's like, "Oh, you're suffering a stroke or a mini stroke." I'm like, "What?" So what happened is that I was sitting at the doctor's office and then my left side of my body drooped over. And so I'm like, "Oh, dang." And so then apparently I suffered a major one on October 2nd and I almost actually shut down my whole body. And so because of that, I almost died. And I was at 210. I was built and I was like muscular. So I went from 210 all the way down to 129 in less than a month. And the only thing that was keeping me alive were IV fluids because they didn't have the feeding tube. It backlogged the feeding tube because my intestines and my stomach was not working, so it couldn't process anything, and so it's just backlogging the machine. So that's how close I was to death.
Wow. So that was 2019.
That was 2019. Yes.
Yeah. So how did that affect your life to start off? I'm guessing you wasn't in the Air Force anymore after that, or did you?
Well, the sad part is that because having that, because I wasn't healthy anymore, and it took me about a full year to get better. I was paralyzed for 4 months in the hospital, and then 6 months in the acute rehab facility, and then about 2 months in the outside therapy and trying to get back to normal of life. But during those 2 months after I got out of the acute rehab facility, I was kind of pushed out of the Air Force. And so it was heartbreaking because I knew my dream, or I knew my opportunity of traveling the world was going to end, and my time of serving the military was going to end. And so what I wanted to try to do is I would say, how do I impact other people's lives? So then I started this ministry called Remember God Loves You. And I'll meet you at the Finish Line podcast. And it was also a ministry. And so we went and traveled around the United States talking about God and uplifting people in a positive way. And so once I got out of the Air Force, that's I really focused on that. And um, now I'm kind of in the position of more of a ministry route, or becoming more of a pastor more than anything.
Yeah. So you still have that opportunity to travel now.
I do. But the sad part is I have to pay out of pocket though, unless it's somebody else is going to pay for it. But it's not paid on government. It's not, the government doesn't pay for it anymore, sadly.
So through all that, the stroke, I mean, what motivated you to keep going, to just keep fighting and move on?
Oh boy, that's a good question. So what kept me going would have to be the do the thought of, okay, if I would have given up, if I would have given up that easily when I was in Russia, if I did not get the food, if I did not go outside the orphanage to get the food, I'd be dead. And that willingness to fight, and that also the willingness to say, you know what, I'm not going to give up. I'm going to fight till the end because I have a purpose, and I can't give up this easily. And so, if I would have given up this easily, I would not be here. I would have not had the opportunities I had. So that's what brought me that's what encouraged me to fight each and every day and to eventually get better, and then also eventually get back to normality of life. Was because that mentality of stating, hey, you know what? You've been through worse circumstances. Don't give up now just because this is another roadblock. Keep persevering and keep on fighting. Because God has a plan for you, bigger plan than you know, and you can't take that away from Him.
So, what would you say is your biggest failure in life, and what did you learn from it?
So the biggest failure of my life, oh wow. Um,
That was on the spot. I'm sorry.
no, no, you're good. You're good. The biggest failure of my life would have to be, eh, it would have to be joining the Army DEP program, the Army Reserves. That would have to be my biggest failure, because that's when I noticed I let a lot of people down. And that's when I noticed that that's when I was a self centered person. I had that kind of a mentality, and it was like all about me. And so, if I was going to join the Army Reserves, I was going to get this whole caveat, and I was going to get this all about me show. But that was the biggest failure of my life. And so, and it was kind of a self centered kind of a thinking. So, I would say that would be my biggest failure.
And for someone who was going to considering joining the Air Force or the Army, what advice would you give to them?
So, the advice I would give to them is look at all your options. Look at all the options of all the military branches, and whether how and not only that, but like how would the Army, give her about 5 years, where would you see yourself in 5 years if you were joining the Army in each of the branches? That's number one. Number two is, how can you make a positive impact within what job you're going to get, and then regarding the job, this comes to number three. So if so in the Army and the Air Force, you have a job. Okay. So I encourage people, if they get like a military job, pick the job that's going to be most practical and get the best benefit when you get out in the civilian sector. Now, you're not going to get like nuclear, if you work with nuclear vehicles and nuclear weapons, you're not going to be able to work on nuclear weapons if you're a civilian at McDonald's. And so, if you're gonna, for instance, work at a house fleet management analysis, and so I took schooling for that with the Air Force offered schooling for that. Now I can work on fleets and be like more of a transportation management coordinator at either an airport or even at FedEx or something like that. So it's kind of utilize that free training, and that's where I'd say with that job, give that purpose with your job or some. Yeah, it's kind of confusing. I'm sorry if I was kind of talking in circles.
Oh, that's fine. That makes sense. Great advice. So Soslan, it's been a pleasure to speak to you. I've learnt so much. Fat and things you've gone through. You just keep fighting. You've got that goodwill. We've learned a lot. We've learned a lot. Is there anything you wanted to add now?
So I am on. I saw. I just want to say thank you for the opportunity. And if anyone is interested in following my podcast, it's called Remember God Loves You, and I'll meet you at the finish line. It's a podcast. It'll change your life, and it's you're welcome to follow it on Apple and Spotify. Just find one of those two, or just put Soslan Soslan in your search engine, and then it'll show up. And thank you so much for allowing me to be on here.
That's no problem. I'll link your podcast into the description for this as well, so people can go straight from there.
Alrighty,
Yeah,
sounds good.
that's it, I think. So thanks for joining us. And
Alrighty, sounds good. Safe travels. Bye.
bye.